West Memphis, Arkansas, 1993. A town of trembling hands clutching crosses and whispered sermons about sin lurking in every dark corner. Beneath the suffocating humidity and manicured lawns, fear festered like a slow rot. It was here that Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Misskelley grew up. Or rather, tried to. Damien, charismatic yet brooding, was a lightning rod for suspicion. His fondness for Stephen King novels, his black clothes, secret pacts in the woods. None of it true. But truth was a casualty long before blood would be. Parents, primed by TV evangelists and lurid talk shows warning of a satanic panic, cast suspicious eyes at anyone who didn't blend seamlessly into their church-going ranks. Damien's mere existence, his refusal to be afraid, to hide his interests, was enough to make him a target. To the town, he wasn't a teenager. He was a walking prophecy of doom. As whispers curdled into accusations, an invisible noose began tightening around the trio, drawn not by evidence or reason, but by ancient, primal fear. Fear of the other, fear of corruption, fear of the dark. No one would realize until it was too late. The real evil in West Memphis wasn't hiding in black clothes or metal lyrics. It was hiding behind bright smiles, polished pulpits, and holy words twisted to sinister ends. Stay with me as we break it all down. But first, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our deep dives into world events. Let's get started. It was an unseasonably hot spring afternoon when West Memphis lost its innocence. 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, vanished after a bike ride through the wooded area known grimly among locals as Robin Hood Hills. Their disappearance sparked a search party that morphed from worried parents to panicked mobs within hours. When the bodies were found the next day, submerged in a muddy ditch, mutilated and bound, the town's collective horror turned instantly into fury. Without waiting for evidence, whispers became certainty. This was no accident. This was evil. And evil had a face they already knew. Instead of looking inward, the town's leaders looked outward for scapegoats. Sheriff's deputies, desperate for leads and under crushing pressure, remembered Damien the boy who had once been caught reading about witchcraft at the library. Remembered Jason, the soft-spoken teen who sketched shadowy forests in the margins of his homework. And remembered Jesse, slow-witted Jesse, who would say anything if asked the right way. Investigators pushed a panicked narrative. They fed the town's darkest nightmares, whispers of satanic rituals, blood sacrifices, devil worship happening just under the noses of good Christian families. They spun these tales into headlines before forensic reports were even complete. Parents, raw with grief, latched onto the myth. Churches filled with fiery sermons warning that the devil walks among us. And in the pews, neighbors began staring at one another with suspicion. The hunt for the real killer never truly began. Instead, a modern witch trial was launched, and it was aimed squarely at 3 lost boys who had already been judged by the town long before the first stone was thrown. The courthouse in West Memphis transformed overnight from a place of justice into a stage for vengeance. As Damien, Jason, and Jesse sat in orange jumpsuits, the public gallery teemed with rage. Journalists, townsfolk, and evangelists packed the pews like a congregation thirsting for a public exorcism. The trial was never about facts. It was about quelling fear. Investigators paraded a parade of so-called experts, a self-proclaimed occult specialist whose only qualifications were reading a few books, a therapist who testified about satanic patterns based on drawings Jason made years earlier. Jesse Misskelley confused and terrified after hours of coercive interrogation, had already confessed, a confession riddled with contradictions and impossible timelines. But that didn't matter. In a town already convinced of their guilt, Jesse's broken words were gospel. Evidence that could have exonerated them. Alibis, lack of physical proof, even the contamination of the crime scene, was buried under sensationalism. Each courtroom testimony twisted them further into caricatures of evil. Damien, the brooding devil worshipper; Jason, the silent acolyte; Jesse, the manipulated pawn. They were monsters to the jury before they ever spoke a word in their own defense. The prosecution built a narrative of satanic panic, feeding the jury grotesque visions of dark ceremonies and blood rites, though no such evidence was ever found. Crosses waved outside the courthouse. Handmade signs called for the death penalty. Even the defense attorneys, appointed and overwhelmed, seemed resigned to the inevitable. When the verdict came, it wasn't a surprise. It was a ritual. Guilty. 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 Damien was sentenced to death. Jason and Jesse were condemned to life in prison, without parole. The town exhaled a collective breath of relief, believing they had banished darkness. But outside the courthouse, behind the smiles and prayers, the real darkness, the darkness that had orchestrated the horror, grinned unseen, knowing it had just tightened its grip. Damien's cell was small, the kind of place where men go to die, but it was the perfect place for something else to grow. A plan. Inside the cold walls of death row, Damien Eccles began to read, and read some more. Books, law texts, anything he could get his hands on. With a razor-sharp mind and a quiet resolve, he started piecing together the puzzle the world had discarded. The true nature of the West Memphis case was far more sinister than the town could ever imagine. He was not alone in his obsession. Late-night conversations with his fellow inmates and occasional visits from a few supportive outsiders fueled a relentless desire to uncover the truth. Among these visitors was a former investigator who had worked the original case and quietly began slipping him crucial pieces of information. Photos of the crime scene, interviews that never made it to the public eye. But Damien's breakthrough came when he stumbled upon an old, dusty record in the prison library, a book about Freemasonry, ancient pacts, and the twisted history of secret societies. His mind lit up. What if the real power in West Memphis wasn't just the judge or the sheriff? What if the strings pulling the town were much older, woven into the very fabric of the community? One name kept emerging in his readings: Reverend Vance Daniels. The respected town pastor, beloved by his congregation, was an expert at keeping secrets, and Damien began to suspect those secrets had more to do with death than salvation. Damien didn't know the full truth yet, but something dark lurked in the church's archives, something buried for decades, hidden beneath the cross, sealed in a cryptic ledger. As the days wore on, Damien sent letters, coded messages, and had contacts outside the prison start digging through the church's dusty records. His letters were cryptic, urging a journalist friend to explore old records at the town's historical society, leading to a whisper of a ritual that had been practiced in secret, a ritual that predated the town's founding, a blood oath signed by the town's founders in exchange for power and influence. The truth was beginning to come together, but each discovery only brought more questions and more danger. The story of the West Memphis Three had been buried beneath layers of fear, rumor, and corruption. But just as the flames of public outrage began to cool, a fire was ignited in the form of Raven Pierce, a documentary filmmaker with a reputation for uncovering the dark underbellies of small-town America. Raven wasn't just looking for a story. She was on a mission. Haunted by the tragic death of her own brother, who had been wrongfully imprisoned years earlier, she saw in the case of Damien, Jason, and Jesse a mirror image of her own fight for justice. But Raven wasn't just interested in uncovering the truth, she was determined to make the world see it. She knew this story could break through the cracks in the public consciousness. She arrived in West Memphis like a storm, her camera capturing everything, her sharp eyes seeing through the town's carefully constructed lies. At first, people ignored her, dismissing her as just another outsider with no place in their good Christian town. But as Raven dug deeper, the cracks began to show. She befriended the few locals brave enough to speak out: a retired lawyer who had once worked the case, an ex-journalist who had followed the trial, and even a few townsfolk who quietly whispered about the truth. As Raven sifted through police reports, courtroom transcripts, and the testimonies from the original trial, a pattern began to emerge. Evidence was missing. Crucial pieces of the puzzle were altered or buried, and the town's power structure was far more connected to the case than anyone had ever suspected. But the deeper Raven went, the more dangerous her search became. The mayor's office, the sheriff's department, and even the local church were all intertwined in ways that should have never been possible. Raven's camera recorded it all, but some things were too dangerous to film. One evening, as Raven returned to her rented house, she found a cryptic message taped to her door. "Stop looking, or you'll be next." It was a warning, and it wasn't just for her. The powers that be had seen her investigation gaining traction, and they were willing to silence anyone who threatened their carefully maintained grip on the town. Raven wasn't deterred. If anything, the threat only steeled her resolve. As she began to uncover evidence pointing toward the Reverend Vance Daniels, a figure who, until now, had been untouched by the scandal, Raven realized the conspiracy went deeper than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just about Damien and the others. This was about a hidden history, a long-running pact that had been keeping the town under its thumb for generations. But Raven wasn't prepared for the terrifying discovery that would come next. The more Raven uncovered, the more she realized she was on the cusp of a revelation so terrifying that it might shatter the town's entire foundation. The case was no longer just about 3 innocent teenagers wrongly convicted of murder. It was about an ancient power, a secret pact, and the forces that had been manipulating the lives of everyone in West Memphis for decades. It all led Raven to an old, decaying church on the outskirts of town, a building that looked innocent enough, its white steeple rising above the trees like any other in a small religious town. But inside, things were different. The church had always been a symbol of peace, but it held a darker side few knew about. Behind the altar, beneath the floorboards, Raven found what she had been searching for: a hidden room filled with old, dust-covered books and papers. The documents were damning. Buried in the old archives were records of a secret ceremony, a blood oath signed by the town's founding members nearly a century ago. The ritual was an offering made to a shadowy figure that promised power, wealth, and influence in exchange for blood sacrifices. The town's prosperity, its safety from financial ruin, its protected status from the outside world had been built on this hidden exchange. But the most shocking part was the list of names. One of them, Vance Daniels, was listed as a direct descendant of the original signers, part of an unbroken lineage that stretched back to the early 1900s. Daniels wasn't just the town's pastor. He was its orchestrator, the keeper of the blood oath. He had been in power for decades, manipulating events and people in the shadows. His sermons were a front, his public persona nothing but a mask. The implications were staggering. The town's leaders, the church, and even law enforcement were all implicated in the long-running conspiracy. The murders of the three young boys, Stevie, Christopher, and Michael, were only the latest in a series of ritualistic sacrifices carried out over generations. Each sacrifice ensured the town's continued prosperity and protection. The boys' deaths were no accident. They were the latest in a string of offerings, and their deaths had been orchestrated as part of a larger, much older plan. Raven's hands trembled as she looked through the records. She had uncovered the key to everything, but there was no way to expose the truth without risking everything. She couldn't back down now. She had already come too far, and the knowledge she had uncovered had made her a target. Someone would stop at nothing to protect the secret. The next day, as she prepared to leave the church and head to the courthouse with this explosive information, Raven was approached by a familiar face. Sergeant Howard Wells. Wells had been a quiet presence throughout her investigation, offering cryptic warnings and subtle hints that seemed more protective than obstructive. But now, standing before her, his expression was grim. "You're getting too close," he said, his voice low. "They'll do anything to keep it hidden." "Who?" Raven asked, her eyes narrowing. "Who are they?" Wells looked around cautiously before leaning in closer. "The people who control everything in this town, the ones who own it, and they won't let you bring it to light without a price." He turned to leave, but paused, casting a final glance over his shoulder. "Be careful, Raven. Not everyone is who they seem." As Raven's mind reeled from the revelation, one thought consumed her. She was in far deeper than she had ever imagined. There was no turning back now, and she had no idea just how far the town's corruption reached. Jesse Misskelley had always been a man out of sync with the world. Life, for him, had always been a haze of confusion, a tangle of distorted memories and fragments of moments he couldn't fully grasp. But inside the prison walls, as the years wore on, Jesse's mind began to unravel those lost threads, not in neat, orderly ways, but in jolting flashes that left him shaken. It started with a dream. Jesse had never been one for vivid dreams. His life had always been more about feeling things in his gut than thinking things through. But in the dark of his prison cell, he began to see faces in his sleep. Faces of people he couldn't recognize, but somehow knew. There was a woman, her face partially obscured by shadows, her voice urgent, whispering warnings. And there were men, too, standing in a circle, dressed in dark robes. Their words were unclear, but the feeling they gave him was undeniable. Fear, power, control. The dreams grew more frequent, and with them came the memories, or what he thought were memories. Jesse recalled moments from his childhood, moments that seemed fragmented, distorted. A young boy tied to a tree in the woods, his body limp. A ritual performed in the dark by people he had trusted, people who had told him they were his family. He remembered the taste of something bitter in his mouth, the flash of a cold blade, and the terrible feeling that something had been stolen from him, something important. At first, Jesse tried to dismiss the memories. He was a simple man, and he didn't understand much about the world around him. But these memories felt real, more real than anything else in his life. He had been there, in the woods, in the circle, forced to participate in something far darker than anything he had ever imagined. One night, in a moment of desperation, Jesse wrote a letter to Damien. He wasn't sure if Damien would even get it, but he had to try. He had to tell someone, anyone, that he wasn't lying. He wasn't making things up. Those weren't just confessions. They were twisted fragments of truth, memories buried deep within him that had been manipulated, distorted by the very people who had forced him into their web. Damien's reply came weeks later, a cryptic, handwritten note urging Jesse to keep digging into his memories. Damien had a theory. Jesse's confession, which had been the cornerstone of their wrongful conviction, wasn't entirely false. It was a distorted version of reality, manipulated through pressure and fear. Jesse hadn't just been coerced into confessing. He had been led to believe something that wasn't true, but also something that had a kernel of truth buried deep within it. It was the hardest thing for Jesse to admit, but Damien was right. He had seen the ritual. He had been there, forced into it as a child, and his memories had been warped into the confession that had condemned them all. The fear of punishment, the need to fit in, the pressure from authorities. It had all led him to believe something far worse than the reality. Jesse's discovery set a new fire in him. The chains that had bound his mind for years were beginning to break, and with them came the realization that the town wasn't just corrupt. It wasn't just the church. It was something even darker, an underground force that had been operating for generations, preying on the vulnerable, the outcasts, the ones too scared to fight back. But as Jesse continued to piece together his memories, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if the people who had done this to him were still watching? He couldn't stay quiet any longer. The truth was out there, buried in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it to light. The truth was out there, but it wasn't what anyone expected. The town of West Memphis, for all its fervent prayers and whitewashed piety, hid a secret so vile it could never have been guessed by the ordinary townsfolk. As Raven, Damien, and Jesse inched closer to uncovering it, they discovered that the town's most respected figure, the beloved pastor, Reverend Vance Daniels, was not just a man of God, but a man of secrets. Vance Daniels had always been the moral backbone of West Memphis. His sermons were the heart of every Sunday, his words a source of comfort for those struggling in their everyday lives. He was a pillar of the community, kind, charitable, and always there for anyone in need. But as Raven dug deeper into the church's archives, she found disturbing clues that shattered the image of the beloved man. Hidden behind the church's pious exterior, Daniels was the mastermind behind a legacy of death. The blood oath, the sacrifices, the power, all of it had flowed from his family line. Daniels wasn't just a preacher. He was the keeper of a covenant that had been forged long ago. His ancestors had signed the original pact, promising the town's prosperity in exchange for the blood of the innocent. Daniels had inherited this unholy responsibility, his sermons and public persona nothing more than a mask designed to veil his true purpose, maintaining control through fear, manipulation, and sacrifice. As Raven began piecing together the evidence, she uncovered something chilling. The murders of the 3 young boys were part of an unbroken cycle, each death a necessary offering to keep the town's power intact. The children were never just victims. They were pawns in a larger, centuries-old ritual. And Daniels had orchestrated their deaths, or at the very least, had been complicit in them. The Reverend, in his dark robes, had led the ceremonies, standing as the spiritual leader of an underground society that had long held the town in its grip. But why? Why had the town's most trusted leader become a puppet master of such evil? The answer was as simple as it was horrifying. Power. Daniels had tasted it, had been raised in it, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. He was willing to do anything, even murder, to maintain the town's prosperity. For generations, the pact had kept West Memphis wealthy and untouched by the outside world. The price? The lives of the innocent. Raven's investigation had just cracked open the door to a nightmare, and it wasn't just a metaphor. As she continued to dig, the walls seemed to close in on her. Someone had been watching, waiting for her to uncover the truth. And now that someone was moving in the shadows, ready to stop her by any means necessary. It was time for Raven to confront Daniels. She had to meet the man who had pulled the strings behind the entire conspiracy. But Raven wasn't prepared for the encounter that awaited her. When they met face to face in his office, the Reverend's calm demeanor faltered for only a moment. But it was enough. For the first time, Raven saw the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. The veneer of holiness cracked, revealing the monster beneath. "You should have stayed away, Raven," Daniels said, his voice soft but deadly. "You have no idea what you're up against." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Raven stood, her hands trembling, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She had no choice now. She had to expose him, and in doing so, risk everything. Because she knew now that exposing the truth would either set them free or seal their doom forever. The day they were released felt surreal, like waking up from a nightmare that had lasted over a decade. Damien, Jason, and Jesse stood outside the prison gates, blinking in the sunlight as the world around them seemed to swirl and distort, still carrying the weight of their wrongful convictions. But freedom came at a price, one they couldn't yet fully understand. The world had changed. The justice they had fought for had come in the form of a documentary, a relentless crusade led by Raven Pierce. She had uncovered the conspiracy, exposed the town's darkest secrets, and helped bring the truth to light. But the town of West Memphis wasn't ready for it. The power structures that had ruled for so long were still intact, and the trio's return was not a victory. It was a declaration of war. The media blitzed them with questions, their faces now plastered across newspapers and television screens. The townspeople who had once stood by them, had once whispered in the dark that they were innocent, now looked at them with suspicion and fear. The town had been betrayed by the very people it had trusted, and it wasn't ready to forgive. But it wasn't just the public who had turned. The trio began to realize something darker, something more insidious. The people who had orchestrated the murders, those who had made their lives a living hell, were still out there, still watching, and still in control. Their release was seen as a threat, one that would expose a decades-long conspiracy, and those in power would not let that happen. The power that had kept the town safe, kept it under control for so long, was not a simple local conspiracy. It was a far-reaching force that stretched across generations, its roots tangled in the very fabric of the community. And the ones who had been a part of it, the town's leaders, the sheriff, even members of the legal system, would do anything to protect themselves from exposure. The first sign that things were far from over came when Damien found a letter waiting for him in his mailbox. It was simple, just a few words. "We know where you are. We will make you regret this." The paper was cold, the ink stark against the white background, a chilling reminder that their fight for justice had only just begun. Jesse was the first to crack under the pressure. The years in prison had already taken their toll on him. But now, in the wake of their release, the fear came rushing back. The paranoia that had lived inside him for so long flared up again, and he began to see threats everywhere. Every shadow seemed to hold a figure in black robes. Every passerby seemed to whisper their secrets to the walls. Jesse's mind, already fragile, began to fracture again as the realization sank in. Freedom was not freedom. They were no longer the innocent victims. They were survivors. But survival was its own kind of prison. Jason, ever the artist, retreated inward. He spent days holed up in a small, rented room, sketching feverishly as he tried to make sense of what had happened. His art, once his escape, became a maze of dark, twisted images, of robed figures, twisted faces, and blood-stained rituals. But it wasn't just the images that haunted him. It was the realization that, even though they had been freed, the town would never truly let them go. They had been cast as the villains in this story, and no matter what the truth said, that was how the world would remember them. And Damien? He had changed in ways that went beyond the physical scars of prison. He had become something else, something colder. He had seen too much, learned too much, and now the truth he had fought for had become a weapon. He wasn't sure what his next move would be, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to run. Not anymore. They were free, but they were not safe. The danger was far from over, and they were no longer just trying to clear their names. They were fighting to stay alive. The storm was coming, and this time, it wasn't just the weight of their past. It was something more, something darker, building from the shadows. West Memphis had always been a town of secrets, but now, as Damien, Jason, and Jesse stepped back into the community they had once been condemned by, they realized the town wasn't just haunted by the past. It was still alive, still feeding off its hidden evil, still clinging to the blood pact that had given it power for generations. Raven, the woman who had exposed everything, had always been their ally. But as the trio stepped into the heart of West Memphis, she felt the first chill of doubt. She had risked everything, her career, her safety, even her life, to bring the truth to light. But now, with the town's corruption fully unveiled, there was no turning back. Raven's courage had led her here, but it was her own child who was now in danger. In the depths of the church archives, Damien had found the final piece of the puzzle. The town's ancient blood pact wasn't just a relic of the past. It was an ongoing ritual, one that required a new sacrifice each generation to ensure prosperity. The children who had died before, they were not the first. They were merely the latest in a long, dark line of offerings. And as Damien pieced together the final details, he realized with horror that Raven's son, a bright and innocent child, had been marked as the next. It was a revelation that shattered everything. As Raven fought to protect her child, Damien, Jason, and Jesse were forced to confront the truth they had been running from for years. They were never just victims in this town. They were survivors, and now they were the only ones who stood between Raven's son and the town's bloodthirsty pact. The town's elite, the same people who had orchestrated their wrongful conviction, were now preparing for the next ritual. The mayor, the sheriff, and even members of the legal system had ties to the cabal that ran everything from behind closed doors. They knew that exposing the town's dark history would mean the collapse of everything they had built. Their wealth, their power, and their position at the top of the town's hierarchy. But the trio had no choice. They had to stop it. For Raven, for the children, for the future. In a final showdown, Damien and Jason infiltrated the church during a midnight service, where the dark figures of the town's elite stood around an altar, preparing for the ritual. The air was thick with tension, the distant sound of chanting rising from the depths of the church as the clock ticked down to the final moment. Raven, frantic and determined, broke in just as the ceremony began, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized she was moments away from losing everything. But there was one final twist. As Damien prepared to expose the truth, as he stepped forward with the evidence that would bring the town's blood pact into the light, he was faced with an impossible choice. Who would he sacrifice? In the chaos that ensued, someone, one of the three, made an unexpected move. Jesse, the boy who had once been manipulated, the boy who had believed in lies, made a desperate decision, one that no one saw coming. With a final, anguished cry, he stepped forward and thrust the knife into the heart of the ritual, stopping it in its tracks. But it wasn't enough to stop the town's grip on the truth. No, the ritual had been interrupted, but the cost was high. Raven's son was lost. A sacrifice made to ensure that the town would never give up its power. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of the town's dark history faded into the night, Damien, Jason, and Raven stood at the edge of a broken legacy. The town would never be the same. Its secrets exposed, its foundation cracked. But the fight for justice had come at a price that could never be paid. And as the final credits rolled, a chilling truth hung in the air. The darkness was not truly gone. It still lived in the hearts of those who had always known it, and it would rise again.